I started campaigning on food waste more than 15 years ago, there really were no public policies, no big policies from the supermarkets to tackle the problem. The level of awareness at the public level was really low, and there weren't stories in the media about it. When I cast my mind back, I can barely believe how far we've come. Last month in New York, the United Nations announced its Sustainable Development Goal to halve food waste globally by 2030. And the US government decided to back them. And they too have committed to wasting half as much food by 2030 as they do now, which for the most wasteful country in the world is really impressive. We see initiatives coming out of big food corporations almost on a daily basis from around the world. My own engagements with Tesco, one of the biggest of the world's food retailers, has resulted in already them committing to measuring and publicly reporting their third-party audited waste statistics, so we really know where the problem is and where to go and solve it. They've started auditing their supply chain, and they have launched a nationwide food donation system from the back of their store as well as in their depots. I still think Tesco have not done anything like as much as they need to, but they've done a lot more than others. And at household level, in the United Kingdom, where it's been measured very carefully, there's been a 21% reduction in household food waste. That's an incredible record. There's hardly an environmental campaign in the world that can show such effective mass behaviour change on a single issue. So there's reason to hope. What frustrates me is that despite campaigning on this, despite getting NGOs, governments, international institutions and corporations behind this issue in what appears to be such a sincere way, it is nevertheless the case that throughout the supply chain we still waste on such a colossal scale. If you can see my slide, this is the result of a recent investigation that I conducted in Peru. So feedback has been looking in overseas supply chains of supermarkets in rich countries, in Europe, America, in Canada. Where do we get our exotic fruit and vegetables from? And this slide shows the 1,000 tons of citrus, of tangelo, that were being wasted by a single packer in Peru. This is a country with millions of hungry people in it. This is a country which is suffering from an exhaustion of its water supplies as a result of overexploitation from agriculture. These are products that are being grown for some of the richest countries in the world. Now, you can question the basis of them growing our food, but what we can surely agree is that if they're going to use their land, their water, their resources, their labour to grow food, the very least that we could ensure is that the policies of our supermarkets, our businesses, don't cause them to waste so much of it. The reason for this waste is the cosmetic standards that are laid down on the product. If you're having difficulty seeing the very minor skin blemish that the producer is pointing out to me on this tangelo, that's the point. You have to be an expert to see the difference between the product that is accepted and the product that is rejected by our over-fussy supermarkets. Now, some people say consumers won't buy it, but I don't buy that argument. We've proved time and time again that if you market it right to the right consumers, people won't even notice that this skin blemish exists. It has no reflection on the quality of the produce on the inside, and it has no impact on the longevity. The same story is true for the asparagus, and of course Peru, with its 11-month growing season, is one of the major global exporters of asparagus. But again, anything, as he's showing me in this slide, that is too thin, too short, too twisted, or the buds are too open, gets left in the field. Yellow onions exported to North America. Peruvians don't eat yellow onions. So even though the producers try to find local and regional markets for anything that our fussy buyers reject, a lot of it is just dumped in the desert. The reason why this particular issue frustrates me so much, it's not the only colossal waste of food in our supply chains, but the one frustrates me most because, as I say, we've shown that with concerted effort by supermarkets, in collaboration, of course, with their buyers, you can change it. This product, I'm assuming, is fairly familiar to the audience. It's green beans. We grow them all over the world. They're very tasty and nutritious. And there's two things that I'll draw attention to on this particular packet. The first is the word trimmed. In other words, they've been trimmed already. You'll notice that they've been trimmed both at the top, where the little stalky bit attaches the bean to the plant, and also at the tail, where there's a wispy tapering off of the bean, which some people are happy eating and some people are not. But the work has been done for you. But the funny thing about these particular beans and the way they've been trimmed is, as you can see, they've been trimmed at the fattest part of the bean, not where it's tapering off, but where it's still at its thickest. And that's a curious thing. And then I draw your attention to the word Kenya, which is, of course, where these particular beans have been grown and flown from all the way to the United Kingdom. And this happens, see, across Europe. The result of that trimming policy is that in order to fit it into the 9 centimetre wide packet that the supermarket has prescribed to the grower it must fit into, they have to trim not just the top and the tail, but 20 to 30% of the length on average of the bean that didn't know it had to be 9 centimetres long before it was grown. Indeed, some of these poor beans grow 13 or 14 centimetres. And this means that the farmers and the packers are wasting mountains of bean trimmings, which represent nutrition and value. These beans, bear in mind, are the ones that have already made it through the race to be the perfect, straight, perfect green bean. Anything that isn't perfectly straight and clean and uniform in length and appearance is already rejected. These are the perfect ones. And then they're chopping off 20% of the bean to get it into these packets. Well, we thought this was symbolic of the absurd level of waste that supermarkets generate in their supply chains, and so we campaigned specifically on this. We, as an organisation, like to show not just the colossal scale of the problem, but also that the solutions to food waste are by and large delicious and nutritious, namely eating and enjoying food rather than throwing it away. We organise massive participatory events. We invite a coalition of organisations to come together to launch national or regional campaigns, and we feed at least 5,000 people with food that has been recovered from the supply chain and that would otherwise have been wasted. It shows people that whether it's in their own kitchens or in the supply chains of the shops that they go to, food waste has an edible solution. We try to celebrate these delicious solutions and communicate that filling bellies rather than bins should be the objective of any good foodstuff. We organised some of these in Europe. We incorporated these Kenyan beans into the ingredients so we could message around that specific issue. And indeed in Nairobi itself, we organised one of the events that we called Disco Soup, which is a bit like a Feeding the 5,000, but with a lot of music. And it's a big party. People dance, they prepare the food, they eat it and share it on the streets to communicate to people the level of the problem. And this is an image of that Disco Soup in Nairobi. And the Kenyans really took to this format. They know how to party, they enjoy their food. We took the evidence to the supermarkets themselves, and they were very uncomfortable with the evidence that we had uncovered in their supply chains. And indeed, overnight in their terms, which was a few months, changed the policies that they were instructing their Kenyan growers with. And they changed the packet to be more flexible with length. And now, instead of trimming it both sides of the bean, they only take the top off. So we think we've got halfway. Indeed, I met some of the growers supplying the supply chain, and they confirmed that overnight this reduced their food waste by 30%, that the value for one grower of the beans no longer being wasted was 70,000 euros. Extrapolated to the export of all green beans to Europe, that would equate to $20 million, which is 0.04% of the entire Kenyan economy. That was a success story. Another success story has been the issue of order cancellations and forecast amendments. When supermarkets predict how much they think they're going to be able to sell, they give an indication, a forecast to their suppliers, and produce is made based on that forecast, whether it's jam or green beans. Unfortunately, those forecasts are sometimes inaccurate. Orders are cancelled. Forecasts are amended. This UK company outside Nairobi Airport wastes 20 tonnes at least of perfectly good food every day. Not only that, they insist that the waste contractors collecting this waste sign a contract saying that none of this food, none of it will actually go to feed people. And that's in a country with millions of hungry people. These growers by Mount Kenya are destroying an entire crop of mange tout, ironically called mange tout, because in fact none of these mange tout will be eaten at all. The order was cancelled and she won't be paid. These day labourers working for less than $2 a day on average are destroying an entire crop of basil because the order was cancelled, and they explained that when this happens they only get half wages, which means they can't pay their rent, they can't send their kids to school, sometimes they can't even feed their families. This kind of unfair trading practice is immoral, and I'm pleased to say that in the United Kingdom, with a landmark piece of legislation that we pushed through in 2013, it is in some cases actually illegal, because cancelling an order without paying the producer compensation for the losses incurred has been banned under the Groceries Code Adjudicator Act, a piece of legislation which we're now hoping will be adopted at least in principle at a European level. Supermarkets, of course, have done a lot. They haven't done enough. What we need to see is the measuring and the publishing of food waste data, not just the stuff we're very familiar with, the stuff in their bins at the back of their stores, but in their supply chains as well. We need to see commitments by those supermarkets to publish and then to reduce that food waste. I think that grassroots activism, amplifying public demand for change, is a really effective way of encouraging supermarkets to do their best to tackle the food waste scandal, and encouraging governments at the same time to follow suit and introduce legislation that can facilitate and incentivise waste reduction. Metro Vancouver organised a Feeding the 5,000, and I hope has had some impact in not just communicating to consumers how much they can save by reducing waste, but also that there's a role for business in this picture as well. The final word that I'm going to give about food waste is that it is a global problem, and it's one that I think we can solve. But it plays an important part in a global discourse that is being conducted at the moment. This global discourse is the one of how we're going to feed the 9 billion people that are expected on the planet by 2050. I am sorry to say that some of the major, most respected institutions in the world are, as my slide shows, backing the message that we need to dramatically increase food production globally by 50, 60, some say by 100% to feed this increase in population and the shift to meat and dairy products. The problem with this cry for action is that it's not just wrong. I believe that it is the single biggest threat to long-term global food security. Why? Because the way in which we're increasing production globally is precisely the way in which we're going to damage the life system on Earth, namely by chopping down the world's remaining forests to turn them into fields. That is how we're increasing food production. And if we do that, we will continue to cause climate change, we will continue to erode soils and overexploit water resources, we will continue to interrupt hydrological cycles in possibly irreparable ways. So the question is, how can we feed the 9 billion people without undermining that life system that we depend on? Well, we can start by reducing waste. More difficult, but also essential, we need to reduce overconsumption in rich countries, in particular overconsumption of meat and dairy products, which we already eat far too much of, not just for our own health, but the health of the planet. My final slide shows that in all rich countries, between 150 and 200% of the nutritional requirements of those populations is actually provided in those countries' shops and restaurants, which in other words means that a country like the USA has nearly twice as much food available in its shops and restaurants than is required by its population. Supermarkets will find it very difficult to combat that problem because their entire business model is based on this cornucopian abundance. They know that we have been hardwired by millions of years of evolution when we see abundance to take some of it and to consume what we can. Behind that marketing system lies the public health crisis of obesity, overconsumption, heart disease, diabetes, and of course, behind the colossal and unsustainable levels of food waste. We all need to play a part in this, both as consumers or citizens, as businesses and as governments. But if we don't manage to crack this problem, we will continue the colossal loss of life on Earth as we're experiencing it at the moment, the mass species extinction and the colossal and global problem of climate change. Surely eating our leftovers and ensuring that every scrap of food is used to its full potential is the easiest and most delicious place to start. Thank you very much.
Thank you.